In the summer before I graduated college, I had the privilege of going to Scotland. That year, my school was one of 3 U.S. universities that were invited to attend a large art festival in Edinburgh. The Edinburgh International Festival has been taking place in August ever since World War II. And for about 3 weeks, performing groups and tourists and university students from all over the world come together to perform vocal and instrumental music, dance, and drama. In fact, the 2023 festival is just entering its final week right now. I went with a theatrical team of about 8 or 9 people to perform an original murder mystery comedy that one of our graduate students had written for us. And in our case, we got to perform our production at around 10 or 11 in the morning, so we had the rest of the day to go do sightseeing, including visiting the Edinburgh Castle, where they had special activities at night. Well, one afternoon, the stage manager, who was a friend of mine, Bill, and I decided to go walk around the city and explore. And we became intrigued with another medieval building that was high up on a hill. From where we stood at the bottom, the only thing between us and it was maybe 800 to 1,000 feet of steep, grassy hill. Since so many thousands of people were in town for the festival, we thought it was odd that such a vintage building appeared to be abandoned. And yet, as we looked up, we saw no one was around it, and so for us, it became an adventure to get a little closer and maybe go inside. I had my 35 millimeter camera with me, and I remember taking a couple of pictures of one another as we were trying to climb up this steep hill, maybe 30 to 40 degree incline. Now, being near the coast of the North Sea, the wind got fairly strong, which made it even more challenging to make the climb. In actual time, I'm not sure it took us any more than about 10 minutes. But when you're being blown sideways with gusty winds, and you're sweating, and you're tired, and you're exhausted, catching your breath, 10 minutes seems like a very long time. As we moved uphill, I remember thinking that this was becoming a lot of work to go see some old stone building. And was it really worth it? And I got my answer as we approached the top. As we kept moving, we observed that there were people up there, just to the right side of this mini mountain that we were climbing. And yet those people had not passed us on the way up. We were alone in that quest. And they didn't look like they ran a marathon the way we did. The closer we got, we began to see an area that went straight across to what must have been an entrance on the other side. And that was my first sense of futility. But it didn't end there. It turns out the hilltop was very active with tourists, not at all what we presumed. And as we were reaching the crest, we could see these people were walking on a paved road that was basically level. Sure enough, it came up from the opposite side of the hill than where we had begun our journey. This realization was so disheartening that I can't even say I remember if we actually went inside the building after all of that. Instead, Bill and I had spent all this energy and time and sweat to scale up a windy hillside, when all we had to do was take the road that had been paved. Now, if you have any appreciation or empathy for such a futile adventure, you are entering the world of Solomon as he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. And in the summary section of chapter 1, the teacher makes a general statement. He asks a rhetorical question, and then he backs up his conclusion with several life observations. Everything is vapor or futile. So what does a man gain? An answer to that question, he offers several illustrations starting with nature. One generation dies, another replaces it. The sun, the wind, and the rivers move in repetitious cycles where much activity and movement takes place, but little changes in the long run. Another example is found in the human experience where the eyes and ears will always take in more but never be filled up, and we run out of things to say, or the things we say make no real difference. And then his final example is about our journey through history. There's nothing new. What has been is what will be. And the greater futility of history is that we all die, and those left behind will not remember us. Now, these are accurate observations of our world, and yet they do not include everything that is true of our existence. since God is always above and beyond what we can see or comprehend down here. But for now, we are invited to draw our attention to what is our common human experience here on earth. As I've mentioned already, the first part of chapter 1 serves as a summary for everything that follows. But now we hear the teacher in first-person voice. And from this point forward, it will be kind of like reading his personal journal, a record of his quest to find meaning and purpose in all sectors of the world. And in the next section, there are two focal points to the teacher's investigation, so they can be added into the list of places in this world where we find futility or vapor. First is our work or achievement. The second is in the area of wisdom. So come with me to Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 12. I, the teacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. As the leader of a nation, Solomon had an amazing platform from which to observe people, activities, and the pursuits of life, along with the customs and beliefs of various people groups. Remember, he married hundreds of wives as he formed alliances with the surrounding nations. Now, politically, that was a very wise move. It brought relative peace during his 40 years as monarch, and it enabled him to interact with all kinds of cultures and worldviews. But spiritually, his marriage practices were a terrible move, and it was the beginning of the end of Israel. But let's start with who it is that's undertaking this examination of life under the sun. As king, the teacher has money, resources, staff, and transportation to go anywhere he wanted to do for his research. This wasn't the typical person sitting on a bench at the bay and wondering what life is all about. This was a serious effort to answer the question that was posed in verse 3. And I don't want you to forget that question the further we get into this book over the next few months. What does a man gain for all his efforts that he labors at under the sun? Now, as king, I suppose he had the option to set aside his normal schedule and begin this investigation. He didn't have to report to a supervisor. He was the supervisor, so his time was his own. In fact, 1 Kings tells us that he had regional governors throughout the nation to take care of business. Plus, he had an administrative staff back at the palace, sort of like a presidential cabinet that were responsible to oversee those overseers. And what's interesting is that nowhere does the writer directly address himself as Israel's king by name. He purposely uses the title teacher, or Kohelet, also pronounced Koheleth. He doesn't want us to see him as the ruler and the monarch and bring with us everything that we know about him from the other Old Testament books. In using this title, his desire is for us to see him as one who instructs others in wisdom, a wisdom teacher. And this professor, if you will, has taken on an experiment with a depth and broadness that few could undertake. So listen to what he has to say. It would be interesting to learn how much time Koheleth actually did take off from work. But what we do know is that his work was comprehensive and not a half-hearted effort. Verse 13. I applied my mind to seek and explore through wisdom all that is done under heaven. This is his level of commitment right up front. And the opening phrase is one that I find interesting. The Greek translation, the Septuagint, of Ecclesiastes puts it this way: to concentrate my heart on. As an administrator of state, he appointed his own heart and will to take on this responsibility to discover. These words describe a level of devotion to a task that cannot be worded any stronger than it is. It's about dedicating yourself in the very deepest part of your personality. And then the terms that he uses in this opening also covers the spectrum of what we would consider good modern research to seek and explore. They're synonyms that have to do with the scope of his task. It's broad enough to make sure that no new information comes in after he's done his research to mess up the research. And it's deep. It's not a skimming of the material, just enough to get a passing grade. It's getting your hands dirty in the process of learning. And beyond the level of dedication that the teacher is bringing with him to his study, he tells us one other thing about his approach. It is through wisdom. Apart from Jesus, this king was the wisest man to live. God had given him that capacity, and he was in a unique position to apply his mind in a way that others could not. While the final descriptive in this first sentence is a reference to the size of the laboratory in which Solomon is doing his experimentation. I applied my mind to seek and explore through wisdom all that is done under heaven. It's a parallel to under the sun, expressing once again the magnitude of the investigation. Altogether, the teacher describes a wholehearted commitment to find answers. It's nothing less than a universal quest for the meaning of life, a struggle to discern what the human condition is all about. But before the verse ends, we come upon a statement that sounds as if God is doing something that's not really nice. I applied my mind to seek and explore through wisdom all that is done under heaven. God has given people this miserable task to keep them occupied. Different translations describe it in other colorful terms like an unhappy business or a heavy burden. What is this task that we humans have been given that's described this way? A search for meaning. Now, the last part of the verse has taken me a decent amount of time to wrestle through. I even called in some experts during the week to try to get my head straight. Is he saying that God is at fault for our search? Is he saying that God gave us this work just to keep us busy? Or is he punishing us in some way? Or is the teacher communicating that it is, in fact, a very burdensome yet very serious responsibility that we carry as those made in the image of God? Well, perhaps I should let you marinate in that for a while we keep going. And then we'll come back a little later with some clarity. Verse 14. I've seen all things that are done under the sun and have found everything to be futile in pursuit of the wind. I love that phrase. It is such a descriptive image of senseless effort, like climbing up the backside of a mountain when there's a road on the other side. And it's another word picture that will become common and familiar to us the further we get into the book. A more contemporary parallel to this would be nailing Jell-O to the wall. But at least you can see and touch Jell-O before it collapses on the floor and melts. And the remainder of the verse sounds familiar as we now focus on an area of life where futility shows up so often. Our effort. All that is done under heaven, all things that are done under the sun. It's our first real examination of this one activity that takes up most of our days on earth: achievement, work, labor. And since it is a larger focus of Ecclesiastes, we will be coming back to this particular topic many times in our study. Now, as evidence of the futility of so much of our effort, the teacher offers a proverb. Verse 15. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. Now, among the house projects that I've been working on is fixing up my shed. And in doing so, I have now wrapped certain areas in aluminum so that they will be protected from the weather. This is a piece of that. The thing about this material is it's very pliable, so you can bend it exactly where you want it to fit the shape that you'd like to have. The terrible thing about this material is you can bend it back, but it will never be straight the way it was before. It just won't. Well, this is the picture I have in mind when I read this verse. But remember, the teacher is speaking about all things under the sun, not just items that get bent out of shape, literally. And this proverb is not about devious people doing terrible things. That's a moral crookedness, which definitely needs to be straightened. But what this is describing is more comprehensive than that. And the second half of the verse has to do with what's missing, that which cannot be quantified. For example, how many words of affirmation does she need to hear before she knows she's loved? How much time has to be spent on something before you can legitimately say you are truly committed to the task? You cannot measure those things. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. This proverb is more of a recognition that life is what it is, that it's not right. It's a statement that something's fundamentally off with life on the earth. But it's not a declaration of surrender. A lot of people see this whole book as very depressing. If something is twisted and can be corrected, we know we ought to try. If we mess up something on a moral level, we need to ask for forgiveness and restore the relationship. If you toss a ball through your neighbor's window, it's your responsibility to do all you can to replace that. But can you unbend every issue that went sideways? Can you fill up what is lacking in every single area of your life and the lives of those that you care about? No. The point is that our life experience confirms that none of our resources or efforts, even combined with every other human being on the planet, will be enough to fix everything that is mangled or missing in the first place. There is always another situation that needs repair work or filling up. The essentially flawed nature of the world is something that is self-evident and cannot be disputed. The second point or focal point of the teacher's investigation has to do with the limits of wisdom. I said to myself, look, I have amassed wisdom far beyond all those who are over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has thoroughly grasped wisdom and knowledge. This is the second time the teacher has appealed to his wisdom in taking on this quest to discover meaning. And he offers a brief resume as to why he is uniquely qualified to tackle the project. As one with great insight, he is able to use the best of our human capacity to apply reason and logic, to see patterns, to collect the various data points as part of the research. And we also have the first chance to look through the window into the teacher's mind when he says, I said to myself. Similar statements will be made that will allow us to enter into his conversations or thoughts along the way. And yet what sounds unusual is what he adds to the description of where he is going to look to try to find understanding. Verse 17. I applied my mind to know wisdom and knowledge and madness and folly. The first two are expected since they've been mentioned already. But the last two? Madness and folly cover both silly ideas and the behavior that goes along with those ideas. They are terms familiar to the book of Proverbs. But they're not about mental illness or learning disabilities. They are most often descriptions of moral failure or perversions of what is true, especially in Proverbs. And because they carry a moral significance, they are about a person's will and choices, not about intelligence. Even if there's not a moral issue at stake, the fool is the one who acts now and thinks more about it later. The fool is driven by his desires and what appears pleasing. Now, why Solomon tries to apply madness and folly in addition to wisdom is not explained. And honestly, it puzzles me too. If true wisdom is from God, and that means we don't have to try everything to know that certain things are not worthwhile, why would you take a foolish route to make a discovery? But that conclusion, keep in mind, is not coming until chapter 12, the very end. For the moment, we're simply invited again into the teacher's investigation as he leaves no rock unturned, looking for meaning even in madness and folly. Perhaps he studied both as an objective evaluation, to see firsthand through experience what is truly wise and what is truly foolish. Whatever the reason, this trio of wisdom, madness, and folly will become a repeating basis for the teacher's quest to investigate all the different areas of life. And yet before we go much further, the teacher tells us what he discovered about this trio kind of up front. So we sort of have our conclusion, and we're going to use the rest of the book to unpack the details of how he came to that. I applied my mind to know wisdom and knowledge and madness and folly. I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. Whatever his thought process was to really understand these three things, he found that none of them brought satisfaction. Now, I would expect that foolishness would lead to both painful results and a sense of disappointment. In the larger picture, the fool is often motivated by emotion, excitement, and something that appears to offer what hasn't been offered before now. While the wise person is motivated by more than the moment in front of him. The wise one is taking some time to weigh his options and then step in to take a step that will be beneficial. For the one pursuing godly wisdom, he's motivated not just by rational thought, but by the fear of God. The fear of God is about knowing that I answer to the Lord above everyone else. And so the wise person will ask, what does he desire? What brings him satisfaction? We're told that repeatedly in the book of Proverbs, what Solomon will later tell us in Ecclesiastes. So this does give us some hope, that wisdom is better than folly. But even wisdom does not always make up what is missing. I applied my mind to know wisdom and knowledge and madness and folly. I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. The teacher has already explained that he's more than qualified to take on this investigation as the wisest man in the world, as one who had life experience like very few of us ever will or could. So what is it about wisdom that cannot bring us full meaning or purpose? Perhaps it is that wisdom and experience cannot solve every issue in life. When it comes to experience, there is great advantage. Experience is an excellent, though often painful, teacher. But life brings us to a place where even our experience sometimes will not help. As we encounter something that's just a little bit less familiar than what we knew before, and now we're at a loss for what to do next. And concerning wisdom, those who like to have an answer for every question in life are unhappy people, because there are some answers that we will never receive on this side of eternity. And even in the case where God could answer, he is under no obligation to give us one. And it may be that the explanation that he could offer is one we could not comprehend. I applied my mind to know wisdom and knowledge and madness and folly. I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. Let me clarify one thing about wisdom before we look at the next verse. It's not that wisdom lacks value. That would be a violation of everything else we know from the Old and New Testament. It's that the pursuit of wisdom is as frustrating as chasing after the wind. The end result is that none of them, wisdom, madness, or folly, can ultimately offer answers or meaning to everything that takes place on earth. In verse 18, Solomon reaches another conclusion that's even more discouraging. I just warn you. And yet it does offer some explanation for why gaining wisdom only added to his sense of futility. But first, let me take you back to the opening question that colors everything else that we're studying. What does a man gain for all his efforts that he labors at under the sun? Solomon offers one answer to that question in verse 18. For with much wisdom is much sorrow. As knowledge increases, grief increases. That's not a very desirable dividend to earn, is it? The opposite of the statement is another modern proverb that I know you've heard. Ignorance is bliss. Or another one, what you don't know won't hurt you. In many respects, these are quite true. Just as verse 18 is a sobering reminder of the weight that obtaining wisdom actually includes. What do you gain? Sorrow and grief. Now, I've heard it said that as your children get bigger, so do the concerns you have as a parent. That's because the problems they encounter also get bigger. It's one thing to offer a hug and a Band-Aid for a skinned knee. It's very different to watch your kid face the first breakup or job loss. How about this increase in knowledge? The more you know about your medical condition, the more questions you have. And the more reasons you can find to panic about the side effects or the financial costs or how it will impact your life from this point forward. The more you know about human relationships, the more you hurt for those who are going down a road that is littered with trouble. Because of your wisdom and experience, you'd long to warn that couple of the dangers they're heading toward, but your wisdom doesn't have much value to them. And so they go on, until they cannot, while you, as a friend or relative, carries the sorrow and grief of watching madness unfold. You know, years ago, we did a study in Proverbs. So it may be about that time that I added this into my current and ongoing vocabulary. There's no wisdom there. It's my way to comment on some foolish endeavor. If I'm asked my opinion on some issue, sometimes I can actually say this, and so it serves as a warning. Sure, you can go down that direction, but there is no wisdom there. Whatever insight I might be able to offer, I still watch the same mistakes over and over again as folly wins over wisdom. And as the years go by, I actually find myself more disheartened, as all I can do is watch situations unfold, but without the ability to fill up what is lacking or unbend what has gone sideways. That's what the author's communicating. It's not the message for the modern church. It's all about God will bless you in every way imaginable. It's the message of a believer who is struggling with inconsistencies of life and trying to make sense of it all. And with 12 chapters in the teacher's journey, we're only at the very beginning. So I'll challenge you once again to live with the tensions and uneasy comments made by the teacher until we get to the end. Some things we read almost sound like unorthodox teachings. They don't seem to easily line up with everything else we know about God's Word. And with that in mind, let's go back to that one verse that sounded a little odd. I applied my mind to seek and explore through wisdom all that is done under heaven. God has given people this miserable task to keep them occupied. What is this about? I am honestly still processing this in many ways, but it has forced me to step back into a larger understanding of biblical teaching. So here are a few perspectives to bring with you into Solomon's investigation for what's behind this verse. And these same perspectives will also help you when we look at future statements that don't seem to unpack very easily. First is God did appoint us to this earth. This was supposed to be our forever home. God gave us work, which was good. He gave us dominion over the earth, which is an exercise of managing resources. As stewards, we have a mandate to organize and administer, collect and preserve, to create, to build, to invent, and to enjoy all parts of the process in fulfilling those responsibilities. In the garden, there was purpose and meaning to be found, first in our relationship with God, and then in his delegation to us. You know what our job is? Property managers. These purposes have not disappeared, but for the average person, they have been lost or are very hard to find. And for those who understand and accept God's hand in life, believers, there is an unending frustration, isn't there, in trying to accomplish any one of them. This is our lot in life. Now, purpose and meaning are elusive, and we have trouble managing the things that we're responsible to manage. But God did appoint us to this earth. So the need to discover meaning and purpose to gain benefits from what we do was built in until sin changed the outcome of those pursuits. Now, we know by experience that the curse is real. And that curse ties directly to everything that's done under the sun. You know, for as many times as I've studied, read, and preached looking through Genesis 3, I have missed something about the magnitude of the curse, which Solomon reminds us here is also true. You see, it's not just about the futility of our human work, yes, by the sweat of your brow, and all that goes along with that. It's that the same effort, fruitlessness, frustration, or lack of dividends that we know so well in our work is also true in acquiring wisdom and meaning. Consider that sensation that you have of not earning enough for the hours you put in, or not seeing enough progress in keeping your home in order the way you want it to be in order. Think about the groans you make when it looks like you've not been able to accomplish anything as you're caring for a young child or somebody with medical needs. That same angst and futility is also involved in our pursuit of purpose, meaning, and wisdom. We have to work at gaining insight. And for every part we come to know, we discover there's so much more we don't know. What the teacher does in the first chapter is briefly describe a reversal of Genesis 1 and 2. And because our work and pursuit of knowledge is now conducted in a fallen universe, consider how that has impacted these core factors in the human quest for meaning. Where am I from? It's a question of origins. Who am I? It's a question of identity. Where am I going? It's a quest for purpose. What would have been a simple process to discover answers to all of this in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 has become a fragmented, lifelong, troublesome issue since Genesis 3. And yet these questions have not disappeared, and the world continues to reach out for answers. So verse 13 is also accurate in communicating that our journey is a heavy burden. The human search for answers to these core questions is difficult, and the investigation does not end. And yet it's built into us to find out. So it's unavoidable to search for value and purpose in what we do, in who we are, and in why we're here. The teacher, fortunately, will tell us later the reason why we experience that inner impatience to settle these questions. Because God has put eternity in the human heart. And the author mentions God several times in his writing. I said that in week 1. Yet since the Ecclesiastes setting is this of the earth, the focus on God is not the same center stage that you would find in other books. And yet by saying that the Lord is the one behind our search for meaning, then here's one other thing to remember about this lot in life. All situations and problems are under God's control. The condition of the earth, the troubles that come our way, the mysteries we cannot solve, are all part of the Lord drawing us to look beyond the circumstances and seek Him for answers. Again, the typical person on earth is not likely to go look to God first. Instead, they will employ an endless array of resources to gain understanding of their situation, counselors and therapists and everything else. And yet that's the futility of wisdom. It can only take us so far. And then it cannot provide any more answers. However, in his search for meaning in work and in wisdom, the teacher has provided a few conclusions from the first chapter. So let me review them with you. First is that God has given people this miserable task to keep them occupied. What is that task? To find meaning and purpose. Next is mankind is naturally frustrated by this. We desire to find value in what we do, who we are, and what we learn, but it's like chasing after the wind so many times. And there are twists and gaps in all things. Even the most learned and wise cannot answer all of life's mysteries and inconsistencies. They cannot straighten out what is crooked or fill in the holes. The pursuit of wisdom, madness, and folly is a chasing of the wind. And wisdom does bring insight, but it also brings sorrow and pain. Once again, in studying a book like this, these conclusions may lead us to despair. Or they may drive us to look beyond this earth to find meaning. For the believer, we already have, in addition to all this, special revelation from God in His Word. And yet that revelation does not promise to answer the futility of life in all its detail. What it does offer is legitimate hope. You see, I don't have to know the answer to every specific question. I take comfort in the fact that I know the one who has the answers, even when He doesn't share them with me. And what He's asked in return is to tell me to trust Him and keep going. Heavenly Father, thank You for these reminders. for the reality of these words that you've put here. One of the few books in the Bible that's just right down in the dirt, demonstrating to us that your ideas of who we are, our ideas of who we are with you, are very real, very three-dimensional. They're not pie in the sky. We stand out in our faith from all other faiths because we have the whole gamut of joy and sorrow and misery and greatness. Thank you that you are the Lord behind all those things. And I pray, because of this text that we looked at today, that those of us who are struggling with looking to find an answer in some part of life, that you would give them the capacity to humble themselves before you, surrender themselves before you, and say, I give up, just lead. Please do your best and let me take my next step. And Father, I pray that you'd restore their faith and their hope, even in the midst of questions that will not go away. Give them a new insight into who you are, your love for them, your concern for them, even your desire to comfort them and be present in a special way. Until we get to ask the questions when we see you, if those questions even mean anything at that point. Or maybe your presence will be enough to just take it all away. So Father, give us grace as we go through this week, living through the details of life, the questions that come up, and enable us to be good examples of your Son in offering some hope through him, even when there's no hope anywhere else. Amen.